Some people think you can steal a lake with a lawyer. Mine tried to do it with a deadline. The smell of fresh pine and cool water filled the morning air as I eased my aluminum fishing boat across the glassy surface of Walker Lake just after sunrise. 600 acres of calm water stretched in every direction, broken only by the gentle rings from my fishing line and the distant cry of a bald eagle circling above the eastern ridge. My name is Nathan Walker, and every inch of this lake had been part of my family's story for nearly a century. My grandfather used to tell me that the water remembered every honest man who respected it. Standing there with the worn wooden handle of his old tackle box still resting against my boot, I believed him. The lake had watched me learn to swim before I could ride a bicycle. It had carried my father through countless mornings before work, and after he passed, it became the one place where silence still felt like home instead of loneliness. The soft hum of my trolling motor was interrupted by the sharp growl of another engine echoing across the water. I turned toward the western shoreline and spotted a sleek white patrol boat cutting straight toward me. Behind it, two black SUVs rolled slowly along the private access road, kicking dust into the crisp morning light. Even before I recognized the woman standing at the front of the boat, I already knew this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. Victoria Sterling never visited anyone unless she believed she already owned something they valued. She stepped onto my dock wearing an expensive cream-colored jacket that looked completely out of place beside old cedar posts weathered by decades of rain and sunlight. Her polished smile never reached her eyes. One of the men beside her carried a thick envelope while another unfolded a temporary metal sign that read property under HOA administration. They hadn't even spoken yet, and somehow the air already felt heavier. Victoria glanced across the lake as though she were inspecting a resort she had recently purchased instead of the place where 3 generations of my family had built their lives. "Mr. Walker," she said calmly, "Board has completed its ownership review. You have 72 hours to surrender all claims to this lake and its surrounding shoreline. Failure to comply will result in legal enforcement and immediate transfer of management rights." She nodded toward the envelope. "Everything is explained inside." I didn't answer. I simply accepted the papers and listened to the gentle splash of water against the dock beneath my feet. It wasn't the legal language that caught my attention. It wasn't the countdown clock they thought would frighten me. It was the way Victoria casually referred to my family's lake as community property, as though 90 years of history could disappear because someone printed new paperwork. As her boat pulled away, my eyes drifted toward the old boathouse sitting beneath a stand of towering oaks. Hidden inside, beneath faded photographs and rusted fishing reels, rested a small cedar box my grandfather had told me never to throw away. For years I had treated it like nothing more than another family keepsake. Standing there with 72 hours hanging over my head, I suddenly remembered the last thing he whispered before he died. "If anyone ever comes for the lake, don't argue with them. Open the box." I stood alone on the dock until the sound of Victoria Sterling's patrol boat faded into the distance, leaving only the steady rhythm of small waves brushing against weathered cedar pilings. The envelope remained unopened in my hand because I already knew that paper could threaten, but it could also protect. My grandfather understood that better than anyone I have ever known. The old boathouse sat at the edge of the property exactly where he built it in 1968, its faded red paint peeling beneath years of summer heat and winter storms. Every board carried the familiar scent of aged pine, engine oil, and lake water. Even after all these years, stepping inside felt like walking into another decade. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight, settling over shelves filled with antique fishing lures, glass lanterns, and tackle boxes that had not moved since the day we buried him. I could still hear his voice telling me to put every tool back exactly where I found it, because one day I would need to find it without thinking. He was never talking only about tools. Walker Lake had never been just another piece of real estate. My great-grandfather purchased the original tract in 1934 after spending nearly 20 years working timber camps throughout northern Minnesota. Every dollar he earned eventually became another acre until the shoreline belonged entirely to our family. They built cabins by hand, planted thousands of pine trees, stocked the water with fish alongside state conservation officers, and signed permanent environmental agreements that protected the wetlands surrounding the lake long before anyone talked about preserving natural habitats. My father expanded those protections after returning from military service, refusing generous offers from developers who wanted luxury vacation homes where loons nested every spring. People often asked why we never sold the property. My father always smiled and answered with the same sentence. You can replace money. You cannot replace history. Growing up here taught me lessons no classroom ever could. I learned to read weather by watching ripples travel across open water. I learned patience while waiting for fish that sometimes never came. I learned responsibility because every fallen tree, broken dockboard, and damaged shoreline became our problem to solve instead of someone else's complaint to file. Those mornings shaped the man I eventually became. After graduating with a degree in civil engineering, I spent years restoring historic bridges and managing watershed conservation projects across the Midwest. Every project reminded me of home. Every successful restoration reinforced something my grandfather believed with absolute certainty. Land only stays in good hands if someone refuses to forget why it matters. I walked toward the back corner of the boathouse where an old cedar cabinet stood beneath a faded photograph of my grandparents smiling beside their first fishing boat. The cabinet door creaked exactly as it always had. Inside rested the small cedar box wrapped in a worn canvas cloth. The brass latch had darkened with age, but the wood still carried the faint smell of cedar that my grandfather loved. I ran my fingers across the carved initials on the lid before lifting it carefully onto the workbench. Outside, a light breeze carried the scent of fresh water through the open window while wind chimes hanging from the porch rang softly in the distance. For the first time since Victoria handed me that ultimatum, I stopped thinking about the 72 hours she had given me. Instead, I started thinking about the 90 years my family had already invested in protecting this lake, and I realized those two timelines were never going to end the same way. I opened the cedar box slowly, half expecting nothing more than brittle photographs and yellowed receipts, but everything inside had been arranged with the same careful precision my grandfather brought to every project he ever touched. The first thing I noticed was an old brass key resting on a folded piece of blue velvet. It looked ordinary until I remembered the matching keyhole hidden behind a loose panel beneath his workbench. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. Whenever my grandfather wanted someone to find something important, he never placed it where they expected. The panel slid open with a dry scrape of old wood, revealing a narrow compartment coated in decades of cedar dust. Inside sat a thick leather portfolio wrapped in waxed canvas that still smelled faintly of smoke from the old cast-iron stove he used every winter. Before I even opened it, tires crunched across the gravel outside. Through the dusty window, I watched another convoy of white sport utility vehicles stop near my front gate. Men wearing bright safety vests unloaded metal fence panels, while another crew planted fresh survey stakes into the ground as though the property already belonged to someone else. The sharp metallic clang of steel posts echoed across the shoreline, mixing with the constant hum of cordless drills and reversing trucks. They were moving with remarkable confidence for people who had never once asked permission. By lunchtime, a temporary gate blocked the main boat launch that my family had built almost 50 years earlier. Bright signs appeared, every few hundred feet. Future community waterfront access. Authorized residents only. Membership registration coming soon. I stood there watching strangers measure my shoreline, while laughing over lunch as if they were preparing a public park instead of taking over private land. The smell of fresh spray paint drifted across the breeze as workers covered the old cedar entrance sign that simply read Walker Lake. A large vinyl banner replaced it before the afternoon was over. Sterling Shores Community Recreation Area. Seeing that name stretched across my family's entrance felt stranger than anger. It felt like someone trying to erase a lifetime with a printer and a ladder. Curious neighbors began arriving throughout the afternoon. Families parked along the county road and wandered toward the docks carrying folding chairs, coolers, and fishing poles after reading online announcements claiming the lake would soon become an exclusive amenity for homeowners inside Victoria's Sterling subdivision. Some smiled politely and asked when membership applications would become available. Others thanked me for finally opening the property to the public. They genuinely believed the story they had been told. Nobody realized they were standing on land that had belonged to one family for nearly 90 years. The most unsettling part was how organized everything appeared. Printed maps had already been distributed. Decorative renderings showed future picnic areas, kayak rentals, and lakeside walking trails. Someone had invested significant money creating the illusion that ownership had already changed. Late that afternoon, I finally opened the envelope Victoria had handed me. Every page carried official-looking language supported by color exhibits, revised parcel diagrams, and references to association authority. According to the documents, my continued use of the lake after 72 hours would constitute unauthorized occupation of community-managed property. Reading those words while hearing construction equipment outside my own window created an almost surreal silence inside me. They were not waiting for a court to decide anything. They were building confidence first, expecting paperwork to catch up later. I looked back toward the leather portfolio resting on my grandfather's workbench and realized something important. If they were willing to move this quickly in public, then whatever they feared had to be hidden somewhere inside the documents my grandfather spent a lifetime protecting. I carried the leather portfolio into the house and spread its contents across the old oak dining table where my grandfather used to review property maps every Sunday afternoon. The rich scent of worn leather mixed with fresh coffee as sunlight streamed through the windows overlooking the lake. Every document had been preserved inside protective sleeves, each labeled in his careful handwriting with dates, survey references, and county recording numbers. Before I could study more than the first few pages, my phone began vibrating nonstop. Emails poured into my inbox every few minutes. One came from an attorney representing the Homeowners Association, another from a title consulting firm, and several more from companies politely informing me that they had been hired to evaluate future recreational improvements on the shoreline. Somehow everyone except me seemed convinced that ownership had already changed. The front doorbell rang. When I opened it, a uniformed courier handed me another certified envelope before quietly wishing me a pleasant afternoon. Inside was a formal notice stating that beginning the following morning, unauthorized access to designated community facilities could result in civil penalties under newly adopted association regulations. I could not help but shake my head. They were writing rules for property they did not own and delivering them to the man whose family had maintained it for generations. Outside, activity around the shoreline continued to accelerate. Workers installed decorative flags along the entrance road while a landscaping crew unloaded flowering shrubs beside the new temporary sign. A drone hovered overhead capturing promotional footage as if a grand opening celebration had already been scheduled. Every passing hour made the illusion appear more believable. By late afternoon, I drove into town hoping someone at the county recorder's office could explain how this situation had progressed so far. The familiar brick courthouse smelled of polished wood and old paper, exactly as it had when my father brought me there years earlier to record a conservation easement. The clerk behind the counter recognized my last name immediately. Her friendly expression faded the moment I mentioned the lake. She lowered her voice and explained that several revised filings concerning adjacent parcels had appeared over the previous 2 years, each referencing updated boundary descriptions submitted by licensed professionals. Everything looked properly recorded on the surface. She could not offer legal advice, but she quietly suggested that I obtain certified copies before making any decisions. I left carrying a stack of records thicker than a telephone directory, yet none of them answered the one question that mattered. How had my family's name gradually disappeared from documents that once seemed unquestionable? On the drive home, I passed a large billboard that had not existed the day before. A colorful rendering showed smiling families kayaking beneath bold letters announcing the future of Sterling Shores. My own lake had become an advertisement before any judge had reviewed a single claim. The evening breeze carried the smell of freshly cut grass as I parked beside the boathouse again. Across the water, I noticed bright orange survey flags stretching farther down the shoreline than they had that morning. Someone was working against the clock, and it was not me. I returned to the dining table, unfolded one of my grandfather's original maps beside the newly recorded parcel diagrams, and immediately noticed something that made me stop breathing for a moment. The shoreline curves were identical, but one small stone marker near the northern inlet had vanished from every modern survey. It was not an obvious omission. Most people would never notice it. But I remembered standing beside that marker as a child while my grandfather smiled and said, "One day that little piece of granite will matter more than people can possibly imagine." The next morning arrived with a heavy blanket of fog drifting across the lake. softening the shoreline until the old pine trees looked like shadows from another lifetime. I carried the original survey maps, the certified county copies, and my grandfather's leather portfolio into the truck before driving to the northern inlet, where that forgotten granite marker was supposed to stand. The gravel road ended at an overgrown trail that very few people still remembered. Years ago, my grandfather insisted we clear it every spring, even though we almost never used it. At the time, I thought it was another one of his stubborn traditions. Now, every one of those traditions suddenly felt intentional. The air smelled of damp earth and wild cedar as I pushed through waist-high grass toward the water's edge. At first, I saw nothing except moss-covered rocks and fallen branches. Then, just beyond a cluster of old white birch trees, I spotted the weathered corner of a granite monument barely rising above the ground. Most of it had disappeared beneath decades of soil and leaves, but the carved survey markings were still visible after I brushed away the dirt with my hands. My grandfather had been right. The marker had never moved. Only the newer maps had pretended it did. I photographed every angle, compared the coordinates against the original survey, and measured the distance to the shoreline exactly as the documents instructed. Every measurement matched the original records within inches. The revised diagrams filed during the previous 2 years were the ones that no longer aligned with the physical monument. That discovery should have made me feel victorious, but instead it raised an even larger question. If the stone had remained exactly where it belonged for generations, then someone had deliberately created paperwork that ignored it. On my drive back, I stopped at a small surveying company owned by an older man named Daniel Brooks, someone my father respected for decades. He studied the photographs without saying much at first. Finally, he leaned back, folded his reading glasses, and quietly admitted that modern boundary updates sometimes relied more heavily on digital mapping than on original field monuments unless someone specifically insisted otherwise. Then he looked directly at me and added something I could not ignore. Original monuments always take priority when they can still be verified. Those words echoed in my mind all the way home. By late afternoon, another package had arrived at my front porch. This one contained glossy brochures advertising future lakeside events, boating permits, and seasonal recreation passes. The association was already inviting residents to reserve access they did not legally possess. Their confidence no longer looked accidental. It looked carefully rehearsed. As the sun settled behind the western ridge, golden light reflected across the water exactly as it had every evening since I was a child. I returned to the dining table and opened the leather portfolio once again, this time examining every page far more carefully than before. Tucked inside a sealed envelope marked only with my grandfather's initials was a folded handwritten note. The paper had yellowed with age, but the ink remained perfectly clear. Across the top, he had written a single sentence that immediately sent a chill through me. If the granite marker ever disappears from the records, do not begin by proving where the boundary is. Begin by asking who benefits from moving it. My grandfather's note stayed on the table long after the sun disappeared behind the trees. I read the final sentence again and again until I realized he had not left me instructions for defending the property. He had left me instructions for uncovering a motive. That changed everything. Instead of asking how the association believed it could claim the lake, I started asking why they wanted this particular piece of water so badly. The answer began revealing itself before sunrise the next morning. I drove into town carrying copies of every recent filing connected to the shoreline and spent hours comparing parcel numbers, easement descriptions, and subdivision plats. As a civil engineer, I had reviewed thousands of technical drawings during my career, and one habit had never left me. Whenever something appeared too clean, I searched for what had been erased. The revised maps looked professionally prepared, but every update quietly expanded the association's influence closer to the water. One adjustment moved a property line by only a few feet. Another altered an access easement. A third replaced an original survey reference with a newer coordinate system. None of the individual changes seemed dramatic. Together, they formed a completely different picture. By early afternoon, I spread every map across the conference table inside the county's public records room. An elderly archivist noticed what I was doing and smiled politely before asking if I needed older survey books from the storage vault. When she returned pushing a cart filled with oversized leather-bound record volumes, the smell of aged paper and dust instantly reminded me of my grandfather's workshop. We carefully turned page after page until we reached surveys recorded nearly 70 years earlier. There it was. The granite monument appeared exactly where my grandfather's original documents placed it. Even more interesting, the earliest records showed that Walker Lake included permanent water rights extending far beyond the visible shoreline. Those rights had never been transferred, divided, or abandoned. They remained attached to the original deed exactly as my family had preserved them for generations. Suddenly, the association's behavior made perfect sense. They were not chasing the shoreline because they wanted prettier views. They wanted legal control over the water itself. That afternoon, I drove around the neighboring communities instead of returning home. Construction signs advertised several luxury housing projects scheduled to begin within the year. Promotional billboards promised private boating, waterfront recreation, and exclusive lake access. Every advertisement featured sparkling blue water, yet none of those developments actually bordered a lake large enough to support the lifestyle they were selling. My family's property solved every one of those marketing problems if someone could convince enough people that ownership had already changed. As evenings settled across the countryside, I parked beside the northern overlook where the entire lake stretched beneath the fading orange sky. Loons called across the calm water while the old buoy bell near the center of the lake rang softly with each passing breeze. My grandfather always said that bell helped fishermen find their bearings in heavy fog. Listening to its familiar rhythm, I realized it was doing the same thing for me now. The association had spent years building confidence through polished presentations, revised surveys, and carefully timed paperwork, but confidence was not evidence. Every polished brochure depended upon one hidden assumption that nobody had questioned. They expected everyone to believe the newest documents simply because they were newer. I looked once more at the original deed resting beside me on the passenger seat and quietly smiled. For the first time since the 72-hour deadline began, I stopped feeling like the man trying to save a lake. I started feeling like the man about to expose a very expensive mistake. The deadline was less than 24 hours away, and for the first time since Victoria Sterling stepped onto my dock, I stopped reacting to everything the association did. Instead, I started paying attention to everything they believed I could not see. I left every temporary fence exactly where it stood. I ignored the glossy brochures that kept arriving in my mailbox. I did not call the association, and I certainly did not argue with anyone standing beside those new signs. My grandfather always believed that people revealed their biggest mistakes after they became convinced they had already won. That morning, I parked my truck where I could overlook the main entrance without attracting attention. The smell of fresh asphalt drifted across the road as contractors finished widening the access lane. Delivery trucks rolled in carrying picnic tables, decorative benches, and stacks of lumber stamped for lakeside construction. Every invoice taped to the windshields listed the same destination: Sterling Shores Community Recreation Area. Nobody hesitated. Nobody questioned whether the project had legal authority. They simply followed the paperwork placed in front of them. I quietly photographed every delivery, every temporary permit posted near the entrance, every contractor sign, and every equipment trailer displaying company information. By lunchtime, I had assembled a detailed timeline showing that construction planning had started weeks before I ever received my 72-hour notice. That discovery mattered far more than I expected. If they had already committed money, signed contracts, and advertised public access before notifying the legal owner, then someone had been operating under assumptions they could not yet prove. During the afternoon, I met Daniel Brooks again at the northern inlet. He brought modern survey equipment while I carried my grandfather's original field notes. Together, we located the granite monument once more, verified its coordinates, and compared them with both the historic survey and the revised association maps. Every independent measurement reached the same conclusion. The original boundary remained exactly where it had always been. Daniel carefully documented every reading, signed his field report, and quietly told me something I had hoped to hear. Any licensed surveyor reviewing these measurements would have to explain why the monument had been ignored. As we packed our equipment, the familiar sound of the buoy bell echoed across the calm water. Daniel glanced toward the middle of the lake and smiled. He said people rarely noticed permanent markers because they expected technology to answer every question. My grandfather understood something different. Physical evidence never cared about public opinion. Back at the house, I organized everything across the dining table with almost military precision. Original deed, historic surveys, certified county records, photographs of the granite monument, independent measurements, construction timelines, contractor deliveries, promotional advertisements. Every document connected to another until the entire picture became impossible to ignore. Then I noticed one final detail hiding inside the association's own promotional packet. Printed in small letters beneath an artist's rendering of families enjoying the waterfront was the scheduled grand opening date. It was set for the following weekend, several days after my deadline expired. They had already invited residents, local officials, and real estate investors to celebrate a property transfer that had never legally occurred. I leaned back in my chair as evening sunlight reflected across the lake through the front windows. For days I had believed I was preparing a defense. Looking at the evidence spread before me, I finally understood the truth. I was no longer collecting documents to prove my family owned the lake. I was collecting proof that someone else had acted as though they owned it before they ever had the legal right to make that claim. I arrived at the county courthouse just after sunrise carrying 2 weathered leather cases that held nearly 90 years of my family's history. The polished marble floors reflected the morning light pouring through tall windows, and the familiar scent of old paper and wood polish instantly reminded me why my grandfather always respected public records more than public opinion. Victoria Sterling was already there, surrounded by attorneys, consultants, and several members of the Homeowners Association board. They stood together with polished binders, color presentation boards, and oversized renderings of the future waterfront development displayed on portable easels. They smiled confidently at local officials and greeted arriving guests as though the outcome had already been decided. I noticed several contractors from the lake standing near the back of the room, along with a few curious residents who had purchased future recreation memberships after reading the association's advertisements. Everyone seemed ready to celebrate a transfer of property that had never legally taken place. When the proceedings began, the association presented polished digital maps, updated parcel diagrams, promotional materials, and recent county filings. Their presentation flowed smoothly because every document appeared to support the next. Looking around the room, I understood why so many people believed their story. Confidence can sound remarkably convincing when nobody has seen the original records. When it became my turn, I walked to the front carrying only the leather portfolio my grandfather had protected for decades. The room grew noticeably quieter. As I removed the original deed from its protective sleeve and placed it beside the earliest recorded survey. Then came the field notes written entirely in my grandfather's careful handwriting. After that, I presented certified copies from the county archives showing the uninterrupted chain of ownership stretching back nearly a century. Finally, Daniel Brooks explained the independent survey completed only 1 day earlier. Using photographs, measurements, and verified coordinates, he demonstrated that the original granite monument remained exactly where it had always been. The revised boundary maps simply failed to recognize it. The courtroom monitor displayed one comparison after another. Historic survey, modern survey, physical monument, certified records. Every layer pointed back to the same conclusion. The original property boundaries had never changed. Then I presented the timeline I had assembled during the previous several days. Contractor deliveries dated before my notice arrived. Promotional brochures advertising future memberships before ownership had been established. Construction schedules prepared weeks in advance. The announced grand opening celebration scheduled before any legal determination had been made. The room became noticeably quieter with every page that appeared on the screen. Several officials leaned forward to compare dates, while others quietly reviewed the supporting records placed before them. Victoria's confident smile slowly disappeared as the sequence became impossible to ignore. The issue was no longer whether my family owned the lake. The documents clearly answered that question. The issue had become why so many public representations assumed ownership had already changed long before the evidence supported that claim. After a lengthy review, the presiding official concluded that the original deed, verified survey monument, historic water rights, and uninterrupted chain of title remained controlling evidence. The temporary claims of association authority could not override those recorded interests. Every restriction placed upon my access to the property was declared without legal foundation, and all activity based upon those assumptions was ordered to stop pending further review. I looked toward the gallery where several contractors quietly lowered their heads while residents exchanged confused glances. Nobody celebrated. Nobody applauded. The only sound inside the room came from pages turning as officials carefully collected the original records for examination. At that moment, I finally understood what my grandfather had been preparing me for all those years. The cedar box, the brass key, the granite marker, the old field notes, even the buoy bell that had guided generations of fishermen across the water had all pointed toward the same simple truth. Facts preserved with patience will always outlast stories built on assumptions. The following morning, the lake looked exactly as it had before all of this began. Thin ribbons of mist drifted across the water, while the first rays of sunlight turned the surface into polished gold. The only sounds were the gentle splash of small waves against the dock and the familiar ringing of the old buoy bell near the center of the lake. For the first time in days, there were no construction vehicles, no temporary barriers, and no workers measuring shorelines that never belonged to them. The colorful banners had disappeared. The portable signs promising future community access were gone. Even the fresh survey stakes had been quietly removed from the shoreline, leaving only small patches of disturbed soil that would soon disappear beneath new grass. I walked down the same cedar dock where Victoria Sterling had delivered her ultimatum only a few mornings earlier. In my hands, I carried the original cedar entrance sign that my father and I had refinished together years ago. The carved letters still read Walker Lake, and despite decades of harsh winters and hot summers, the wood remained solid because it had always been cared for instead of replaced. I secured it back onto its original posts overlooking the entrance road. Stepping back, I realized nothing about the lake itself had actually changed. The pine trees still leaned toward the water exactly as they always had. The granite monument remained quietly watching over the northern inlet. The buoy bell continued marking the rhythm of the wind without caring who believed they controlled the shoreline. Even the old cedar box rested safely inside the boathouse, waiting exactly where my grandfather intended it to remain. Only one thing had truly changed. I finally understood why he protected every document with such care. Later that afternoon, I received confirmation that the temporary restrictions against my property had been formally withdrawn while officials continued reviewing the broader record changes that had surfaced during the proceedings. Several contractors contacted me directly to apologize after learning the complete history behind the property. A few admitted they had simply relied on the documents presented to them without questioning whether the underlying ownership had ever been verified. I did not blame them. Most people trust official-looking paperwork because they assume someone else has already confirmed the facts. That assumption had almost rewritten 90 years of family history. Before sunset, I carried my grandfather's leather portfolio back into the boathouse. I placed the original deed, the handwritten field notes, the certified surveys, and the brass key exactly where he had left them. Then I folded his handwritten note and returned it to the envelope. This time I understood every word. He had never expected me to memorize property law. He wanted me to remember something much simpler. Real ownership is protected long before anyone challenges it. As evening settled across the lake, I launched the old aluminum fishing boat one more time and drifted slowly toward the center of the water. The cool breeze carried the scent of cedar and fresh pine, while the fading sunlight reflected across the same 600 acres my family had loved for generations. Looking back toward the shoreline, I could see the restored entrance sign standing quietly beneath the trees exactly where it belonged. I smiled as the buoy bell echoed across the calm water, sounding almost like an old friend welcoming me home. In that moment, I realized the greatest victory was never about defeating an association or proving someone else wrong. It was about preserving the truth, long enough for it to speak for itself. My grandfather once told me that paper could outlive lies if someone cared enough to protect it. Standing there beneath the quiet evening sky, with Walker Lake stretching peacefully in every direction, I finally understood he had been right all along.